It's nice to be here with you all, and I'm most grateful for having been invited to this dialogue and to hear the speakers before me and interact with people around what is happening in this domain of happiness. I got involved in a demonstration project when I was a very young man. So when I was 27, I had a very marked moment in my life when I said I will only make my career out of what I love. And when I was in my very early 30s, I began working at the University of Massachusetts Medical School with a dear friend and colleague of mine named John Kabat-Zinn, in a clinic that was nascent and virtually brand new. The idea of, would it be possible to bring authentic meditation training into mainstream medicine and healthcare? For just some of the reasons that Cass spoke about earlier. What about people in pain? What about people who've just been diagnosed with something, or their children? What is the level of suffering that they're experiencing? And how might that in some way be mitigated? Or could they be actually taught to work with it in some way? And that's been the trajectory of my work across 35 years. A lot of that work was clinical, and then taking, I don't know, thousands upon thousands of hours of clinical time and turning it into the development of a professional education and training school and a research institute and a larger network affiliate model where mindfulness is now beginning to spread around the globe in a way that both honors the sacred in human beings and yet honors as well that it is being moved into large non-sectarian institutions. The idea for us was, how could you take something so radical as that and put it into a mainstream academic medical center? Would people come forward? Would physicians refer their patients to it? And would people take to it? Beyond the cultural baggage that it might come with. So that's what I'm going to talk with you about today. So rather than talking about mindfulness, I'd like to actually explore with you mindfulness. So right now, for instance, could you notice the quality of your attention? And let's even begin with something as simple as sitting in your chair. Can you feel yourself sitting here? What would it be like to take your eyes off your cell phone right now? I'm serious. We've got these, they're fantastic, they're addictive. And they're doing some things to us that are not so good, as well as things that are good. So, take a look at this image. So this is the way it could be for lots of us, that the horse is driving the cart. That somehow or other we're early on in this digital world, and we love these things, and they're incredibly useful. I'm not a Luddite about it at all. In fact, a lot of the neuroscience research that's come out of our lab is because we're using technology. But how do we use it? And on one hand, it's true that human beings are great at adapting, but the question as well to me is how do we adapt the technology to being human? And so I think there's some challenges. That's what I was asked to talk about today. There's some challenges in the digital age around what's happening. This is not to decry it at all or criticize it, but levels of disattention are surely rising in some domains. The data is pretty clear about that. Our sense of both having devices that connect us, and at the same time, loneliness is rising in the world. Isolation is rising in the world. The sense of disconnection is rising in the world. What is that about? We need to face these as well. And I'm going to talk about what I call forgetfulness as the third challenge. So it seems to me that on one level, I don't know how it is for you, but have you noticed how momentum is intoxicating? More momentum, more activity, more doing. How do you do? And we tell them what we do. And it seems to me that on some level we need to sober up around where are we moving and how to do so in a way that's measured, useful, adaptive, and human. And that means we actually have to get sober in some very real way. Like, just notice how many moments your eyes go to this. How hard it is to take your hand off it. I just read some data that it's 564 times a day that we grab this thing, on average. That's a lot of time. I'm not sure I want to be productive all that time, or in a particular way. So this is a kind of textbook definition of mindfulness that's probably more persistent in the literature than anything else by my dear friend John Kabat-Zinn, the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose, non-judgmentally in the present moment. Well, that sounds pretty straightforward, doesn't it? Well, let's try it right now. Like, could you actually feel yourself sitting in your chair? If you could stop writing for a moment. Not think that you're in your chair, but pressure on your backside, pressure on the floor where your feet meet the floor. What's happening in your face or your jaw? Where's the mind right now? Is it forward, into the future, backward, into the past? Caught up? And of course, no need to judge it, it's to know it in some way. So there's a way of making space, a kind of openness and inquisitiveness that involves discernment and equanimity and some sense of wholesomeness. It's as if we're really now on a precipice towards what do our actions contribute to? To less suffering? More suffering? All of this is in service of one thing, in some ways, of being awake. And knowing it. Knowing it. So what does that involve? It involves the capacity to stop. Because when we stop, we almost automatically see things a little bit more clearly, or a little bit more broadly, or a little bit more differently. And that stopping and seeing leads to a certain kind of, oh, I see this in new ways. I understand it in new ways. And then we have more choice. It's not a problem looking at this. It's a problem if we don't have a choice. Because then it has us, just like the horse had the cart. So it's possible for people to learn this. It takes time, but it's possible for all of us. Because there's a technology, if you will, that has been developed across thousands of years, across every culture in the world, that's actually taught people how to stop, see, understand, and choose. Choose wisely. And our small demonstration project now, 40 years later, was to say, could it actually happen inside of a large social institution? That institution called medicine. That institution called healthcare. And are the implications way bigger than medicine and healthcare? Because there are other large social institutions like education and the law. Now you name them. Government. That's why we're here. So I don't know if, well, I'm 69 years old. I remember seeing this photo when it first came out. Some of you might not have seen it then, but you may have seen it since. This image was the first image of the Earth taken from another place in the solar system that someone was standing, some human being. And it shifted our perspective enormously. And with Edgar Mitchell, you know, I didn't put in everything he said here, if you know his original quote. You develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and you want to do something about it. He calls it a compulsion. And he had a lot more to say that in very rough language about what he hoped to do with the politicians, about taking them by the scruff of the neck and bringing them out 247,000 miles and having them look at the beautiful planet. So really what he was talking about here was relationality, his instant global consciousness. Changed his life forever. And I'd like to suggest that there's lots of definitions of mindfulness, but ultimately it's about relationality with ourselves, with our own bodies, with our own minds. What is happening in the world if the level of mental health, mental illness is increasing? We've lost some relationship with the mind. And then there's relationship with others. We get a chance to talk with each other, not just on these things for the next 4 days. Wow. This country set up a possibility for us to actually meet one another and speak. And you know, there are lots of research about this now, that we're not talking to one another. So think about it as relationality with self, other, and the world. And, you know, this is a kind of image of what we've created, this kind of mind of the planet, this networking of the planet. It's like a brain, you know? And yet, we're still walking around like this. These are images, of perfect anatomical images made by a Moroccan-born sculptor, Bruno Catalano. You see everyone has a bag. Everyone's searching. Everyone's got holes. So maybe part of our work as well is to remind ourselves of this. And not in some way that makes us feel less than, but more in terms of if we honor that we are trying to really recapture our sense of wholeness. Maybe that's what we're talking about when we say happiness. I don't even know if I'm happy. I don't know if you've ever wondered that. Am I really happy? I mean, I'm at the Global Summit for Happiness. I don't know if I'm happy. But I will say something about what I know about that I think is as important, or maybe we're talking about the same thing in different words. So you might know this man. He's not alive any longer, but pretty amazing human being. Václav Havel went from a playwright and an artist to an activist to becoming the president of the Czech Republic in the so-called Velvet Revolution. And he says the only option is to change in the sphere of spirit, the sphere of human conscience. And I'm going to talk a lot about that. We talk a lot about consciousness, but what about conscience? And that will involve us stopping. And perhaps moving from some level of disattention to paying attention. So here are a few ways that we might do that. We might learn that we could actually stabilize the mind through the awareness of the body. We need to teach ourselves about that and be taught it, because we forget it. We probably want to become more intimate and firsthand with the relationship between what we call this body and what we call the mind. Do you notice how interactive they are? Indispensably tied together. You might want to experiment with single tasking. I know in my institution, I remember in the old days, all the personnel job descriptions ended with must be able to multitask. Now they've taken it out because they're discovering it doesn't work. You think you're able to do 20 things, but you're just switching, and not being so effective at finishing the report, having the meeting, speaking with your colleagues, following through. We're not machines. That's a machine term. We might, attending to ourselves a little bit more closely, actually learn to become a little bit more intimate. The researcher at MIT that's looked a lot at these devices, Sherry Turkle, she calls them intimate machines. And there's something useful about the term. They do help us in some ways feel connected to other people. But at the same time, how many of you have walked and seen in a restaurant? I just saw it the other day. A family of 4, they did not speak to each other for 40 minutes. They spoke to their phones and to their iPads. They might have even told each other what they were ordering. I don't know. And how they were feeling. When was the last time you called somebody rather than texted or tweeted? You might just try that once in the next 24 hours. Voice to voice. There's some really good data about what happens when there are devices present among couples. They stop talking intimately with one another about their deeper issues and concerns. Just the presence of it on the table. Because it appears as if this gets us access out, and it's very seductive. Yeah. And what about becoming curious about looking each other in the eyes and noticing what's happening when we're in the nonverbal domain among families, friends, co-workers? How many times have you noticed that you're working at your computer and a colleague comes into your office, if you have an office, or into your cubicle or space, and you've got one eye on them and one eye on the computer? And it's almost impossible to tear yourself away from the computer to say, "Good morning, James." So there's this level of intimacy that I want to talk about and encourage us while we're here to begin to play with. Because mindfulness isn't just about sitting still, closing your eyes. That's an aspect of how we train ourselves. It wouldn't be happening in a medical school. We've seen 25,000 patients in our clinic. We see them for 8 weeks at a time, not for one visit. Their completion rates are more than 90%. So they keep coming back because they're learning something about themselves, their relationship to pain, their relationship to illness, the relationship of illness to their family members, to their friends. They're becoming more intimate with their experience. And we haven't learned that. We want to push it away more often than not. And so I think and it's easy for us to forget. And so we have to be deliberate about remembering. Well, remembering what? Well, I carry this around in my wallet. I don't know, must be decades ago now. My old teacher, he gave me 4 little dares. Dare you, be in the world and not of the world. Have possessions without being possessed. Have a position of duty rather than a right as serving a higher purpose than your own. Dare you give love rather than seeking to receive it. There's nothing wrong with receiving it, of course. But what does it take for us to give, to really turn ourselves towards the other? It really takes this. And I don't mean this in some sappy way, some romantic way. The truth of the matter is our capacity to meet the suffering that's going on in the world and why we're here today is in large part an act of conscience. If we allow our conscience to be provoked, we'll see that there's a lot of suffering. And to meet it, something's got to crack open inside us, or else it's too overwhelming. This is broken. So here's some tips. You might take up the practice of meditation sometime every day. Maybe Blaise Pascal had something when he said all the trouble of human beings is that you can't sit alone in a room. We can't sit in a room alone and be still. What if we begin to study the self? Notice how easy it is for us to get caught up in me. What if we begin to really identify and honor our ideals? You know, I don't know how, I haven't ridden the subway here, the metro here, but I know in some parts of Europe, when you take the subway or the metro, when you're getting out of the doors, it says, mind the gap. So I've taken it as a really useful practice to mind the gap, the places where my values don't and our ideals don't match my actions. Where my ideals and my values don't match my actions. What if we make it a practice to, in some moments, to become just a little bit more intimate with life? Like the sun is out when you go outside, and there's people sitting next to you right now. What if we actually decided we wanted to do the unattainable? What else is there to do? Why not? That's why we're here. I bet you 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, most global governments would say, making citizens happy? Impossible. Why bother? What about the GDP? Well, things are changing. This is a picture this is a guy that lives not too far from where I live. He's 82 years old. He's a barber. Every Wednesday, he goes to the park in a big city where he lives, and he brings his chair and his clippers and a car battery to charge, to run the clippers, and he shaves and cuts the hair of homeless people every Wednesday. He doesn't ask for a penny, but he asks for one thing. When they're done, he asks for a hug. Comes back next Wednesday. Simple something. So, you know, we have somehow corrupted this word often, love, and we think of it as something sweet and romantic, and at moments it is. But it's pretty fierce and intense in another way, as you well know. You want to take on the world becoming more happy? Well, what's going to drive that? What drives that in us? It's care, it's sympathy, it's tenderness. It's love for the other. And I'd like to suggest you ask yourself this question, as much as you might. Have I ever been diminished by offering love to another human being? Have I ever been diminished? You could offer lots of other things, but have I ever been diminished offering love to another human being? Thank you.